much, Dave, for joining us and sharing your expertise on our channel. Now, joining me on the telecast is my colleague Megha Sharma, Senior Executive and Editor of NewsX World, reporting live from Banff, Alberta, to discuss what transpired on the first day and the major issues expected to be on the agenda on this important day 2 of this G7 summit.
June 16th now, yesterday, the heads of the states of the G7 nations, which includes the United Kingdom, Japan, United States of America, France, Germany, they all arrived and were hosted by the Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney. Now, all these leaders, after having arrived yesterday at Kananaskis Lodge, where the G7 Leader Summit is going to take place today. And today is where all the action is, because in Kananaskis, because yesterday was a day when the leaders arrived, today is when they are going to be holding a number of talks on the sidelines. Of course, bilaterals are going to be very important to make note of, and what are going to be the outcomes of these bilaterals after the leaders speak to the media during their photo ops as well. We already saw that Keir Starmer was the first head of state with whom Mark Carney held his bilateral. This was ahead of the G7 summit, and this took place yesterday in Ottawa. And after having that bilateral with Keir Starmer, both the leaders then descended to Kananaskis to take part in the G7 leaders summit. Besides that, there are the other G6 countries are going to be vying for a bilateral, a one-on-one or a pull-aside with US President Donald Trump. It is but obvious because the tariff sword hangs on the heads of all countries, barring none, which includes the G6 nations that United States of America is dealing with, and also of the non-G7 countries, the invitee nations, the observer nations, including India, South Korea, Brazil. They all are dealing in their own way how to circumvent the tariffs that have been announced by Trump, the warnings that have been given, but at the same time hoping for a thaw of sorts, so that both countries, the respective countries, are mutually benefited from this tariff war, and then of course the big focus is obviously going to be the round table, the G7 round table that takes place. Mark Carney has laid out these important points, the agendas that he says are going to be the overall arching points for the G7 summit, leader summit, and top of it is the security and peace across the globe within the G7 nations. He has particularly laid emphasis on building supply chains for rare minerals. He has spoken about peace and dialogue as the way for democracies to function in tandem with each other. But one cannot lay more emphasis on what has happened in the last few days, the Israel and Iran conflict that has hit Iran hard. There have been over 200 people that have died, innocents who have lost their lives, the nuclear facilities that have been targeted ruthlessly by Israel, their military equipment, military infrastructure, their scientists and top military commanders that have died in this Israeli strike. There have been counter strikes that the Iranian Revolutionary Guards have initiated against Israel, but not as much damage has been done as Israel has done to Iran. So this is going to be the single most biggest talking point amongst the G7 nations. Keir Starmer already released a statement after the G7, after his bilateral happened with Kani, that it is going to be a point of discussion. It is going to be the focus point for the G7 nations to find a solution, a viable solution, moving towards a dialogue, moving towards peace talks. But how much of it will actually turn into reality? Only time will tell. So these are, and of course, when you see that the Ukrainian president Vladimir Zelensky has been invited, which obviously means that Ukraine and Russia conflict is going to be on the agenda. The French President Emmanuel Macron, before he arrived in Kananaskis for the G7 summit, was in Greenland, and in his statement over there to the press, he said that he is going to try to persuade Donald Trump to impose more tariffs, more sanctions on Russia. Now, whether Trump is persuaded and takes heed to what the other G6 nations, who are all in support of sanctioning Russia, whether he agrees to this proposal, it doesn't seem likely, because he is not up until now, succumbed to the pressure of the European Union, NATO nations that have been wanting United States to impose more and more sanctions on Russia. So these are issues that are going to be on the top of the agenda at the G7 Leaders Summit, Day 2. Most interesting, most exciting, because all the action happens today. And tomorrow there is going to be the joint communique that is going to be released, which will be an encapsulation of outcomes of the Leaders Summit.
Megha, can you provide an update on the status of India-Canada ties with respect to the G7 summit? How has the dynamic between the two countries changed following Mark Carney's entry into this picture?
Prime Minister Narendra Modi has completed his Cyprus visit that lasted 2 days, from 15th of June to 16th of June. And on 16th, he is going to be arriving in Alberta in Canada. He will be in Calgary, and from Calgary, he will reach Kananaskis, where the G7 Leaders Summit is taking place. And it's important to note that high on the agenda is going to be the bilateral talks that will take place between him and his Canadian counterpart Mark Carney on the sidelines of the summit. There has been a lot of talk that has been going on globally and in domestic media about what is the perception that has been created after Mark Carney decided to send an invite to Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi over a phone call, and Prime Minister Modi graciously accepted that invite for the G7 summit. There was also, just a few days ago, Anita Anand, who is an Indian origin Canadian, who has been picked by Mark Carney himself to be the Foreign Minister of Canada. She was the one, after having elected, the first phone call went to the Indian External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar, and talking about resolute steps that India and Canada can take to strengthen their ties diplomatically, strategically, economically, and at the people-to-people connect as well. And if you talk about what are the likely points that are going to be covered by both the leaders during their discussion that takes place in the bilateral. Number one, of course, we talk about trade and economics. Now, there is about $10 billion worth of trade that happens between both the countries, and to resuscitate the the trade and economic ties for both countries, it is important to have a reset in relationship. Both India and Canada are set to gain from it, and it's highly important that it happens sooner than later. So that is going to be, amongst the top of the agenda items that the leaders are going to pick. Remember, there were talks of completing the bilateral trade agreement between both countries, but that came to a standstill because of the strained ties between India and Canada under the Prime Ministership of Justin Trudeau. But with a more pragmatic view that Mark Carney seems to be taking, the likelihood of restoring ties and particularly trade talks towards a bilateral trade agreement cannot be ignored, cannot be sidelined. Number two agenda, and that has of course been the focus of media across the globe. This was the very reason, the killing of Hardeep Nijjar that happened, the assassination of Hardeep Nijjar that happened, and the blame that the Canadian government under Trudeau put on the Indian government for being involved in this assassination, which India has time and again resolutely denied, rejected. And that was the tipping point of the relationship nosediving between the relationship of both the countries nosediving. That itself could be a point of conversation between both the leaders. Mark Carney has already made a public statement in this regard, saying that the law enforcement agencies in India and in Canada are working together. They are cooperating and to ensure that a fair and just investigation takes place in this case. In fact, Mark Carney even went on to say that it would be remiss if Canada does not invite India for the G7 summit, keeping in mind India's stature as the fourth largest economy and the most populous country of the world. The number three issue that could likely be taken up by both the leaders when they hold their bilateral is going to be about the Khalistani terrorist extremist movement that has been gaining ground in Canada for several decades. India has been seeking support and cooperation of the Canadian government in rooting out this secessionist agenda by the Khalistanis, and violent protests that have taken place, anti-social activities that are being taken under the pretext of building a separate, under pretext of building a quote-unquote sovereign separate state of Khalistan. And these secessionist movements are in fact hurting the very essence of sovereignty and of integrity, territorial integrity of India, and this has been communicated time and again by India to Canada. So what is Mark Carney going to do after he holds these talks with Prime Minister Narendra Modi? Does he help in rooting out this scourge of Khalistani terrorism? Is something that we are going to be keeping a close eye on as well. So and of course, the issue of the people to people connect, cultural ties, education, very importantly. The largest number of students that immigrate to Canada are Indians, and they travel to Canada for higher studies, and that brings a lot of revenue into Canada. And these strained ties have led to a loss that Canada at this point of time cannot bear because of its slowing economy and high inflation. So these are the points that are going to be discussed between the two leaders, and at the same time, Prime Minister Modi is going to be, maybe a pull aside that happens, or maybe a bilateral that happens with US President Donald Trump. Of course, that is going to be something to keep a close eye on, keeping in mind that India has been wanting to have a trade deal with the United States of America. There have been talks that have been going on at the trade representative level, at the Commerce Ministry level from both the states. The Commerce Secretary Lutnick and Commerce Minister of India Piyush Goyal both have been having talks, meetings, and the likelihood of a deal being struck between both countries is likely to happen sooner than later. Meanwhile, other bilaterals are likely to happen with the Italian Prime Minister Giorgia Meloni and the Japanese Prime Minister Shigeru Ishiba and other leaders as well. Meanwhile, when the G7 joint communique takes place, India definitely will have a say when it comes to the Ukraine-Russia conflict and the Middle Eastern crisis that the world is seeing.
Thank you very much, Megha Sharma, for joining us all the way from Banff, Canada. Now, to further discuss the G7 summit